Hey everybody, welcome back this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, for another episode of the Concealed Carry Podcast. Jacob and I are wearing matching hoodies today. Way to go.
It's a cold day. Good day for a hoodie. Yeah.
Yeah, single digits last night for the low. Pretty cold. I mean, it's not entirely unusual in Colorado, but it hasn't happened a lot yet this year. So
it's a stark reminder of our origins, my friend.
That's right. That's right. So, anyway, here we are, Jacob and me, back together. Got the gang back together. First time in a while. I think you kind of had last week off.
Ooh, yeah, I've been trying to get down to the warehouse and help ship orders more because our fulfillment team just got slammed for like a week and a half there, and they could not keep up with the volume. So I've been shipping a lot of orders lately.
Yep. Well, and we had a couple of instances of guys being gone.
Mm-hmm. We had a holiday.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So you were busy shipping stuff out, and Matthew and I were doing the podcast thing. But anyway, I'm glad to be back with you. And today we're going to go back to our roots a little bit, as far as we're going to tackle, a relatively simple topic, but one that's relevant nonetheless. So,
and opinionated. We'll see.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, people got feelings about this.
Well, we'll find out just how opinionated you and myself are.
That's right.
Well, we got a bunch of you joining us and watching. So hello, Bobby and Randy and Andrew. Bobby and Randy on Facebook and Andrew on YouTube. Thanks for joining. Without further ado, I think we just get this party rocking and rolling. All right. So to sync with my backup recorder, I'm going to add a little clap. Here we go. In 3, 2, 1. This is the Concealed Carry Podcast, episode number 476. Okay, that's enough, Jacob. And welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast, the concealedcarry.com network. I am your host, Riley Bowman, joined by co-host, company president, founder of many things that are awesome and some that are less so, Jacob Paulsen.
Thank you, Riley. Yeah. And Riley is the guy who loves those superlatives. Man, just loves them so much.
Hey, we are glad to be with you all today for our second episode recorded today on this Wednesday, January 27th. Episode 476. We're going to talk about 4 trigger types and maybe how to choose the one for you, whatever that is. I don't know. We'll get into what that is and what those 4 trigger types are. And it's a great episode. All right. Some things to consider, and a lot of it, I think, is just going to give us an opportunity to talk about what some of the things are that we think are important with regards to trigger that is on your gun, particularly a defensive gun. Today's episode is sponsored and brought to you by Ready Up Gear and the new Ready Up Gear Roger 22 Ear Pro. Okay, the earmuffs. Jacob's got the brand spanking new ones there with the new logo on them and everything. Look at that. Ready Up Gear Roger 22. Mine's actually like a prototype version. And also we have in stock. These were out of stock as of like Black Friday, because we ran a pretty good sale on them on Black Friday, and they flew off the shelves. But we've got these back in stock now. And along with those, we have these new Ready Up Gear Soft Seal gel ear pads, and these are the perfect upgrade for your for the Roger 22s if you want to do them. I highly recommend it. These mean that I can wear my Ear Pro all day at the range and not be uncomfortable. But not only do we have the soft seal gel ear pads for the Roger 22s from Ready Up Gear, we also have them that fit. Let's see, we've got them for the Pelter 3M brand earmuffs. Okay. We've got them for walkers as well. And then we've got the Roger 22s, and it also happened to be the same. They're the same size, dimensionally, and everything as the Howard Light earmuffs that are pretty popular as well. So, we just did a little bit of market research, and the 3 most popular ear pro, over the ear hearing protection. And so 3M Peltor, Roger, these new Roger 22s, Howard Lights, and Walkers, all 3 of those are options available in the Ready Up Gear store now. So head on over to readyupgear.com, check out the new electronic hearing protection Roger 22s, and outfit them with these sweet gel ear pads that we call the Soft Seals.
It's one of those things you never go back on. Once you have the Soft Seal, once you have those gel ear pads, never again. You'll never wear anything ever again.
Pretty much. For over the ear, absolutely. As much time as I've spent on a range, yeah. Once you go there, you will not go back. That is absolutely true. Well, let's get into today's topic. So 4 trigger types, and how do we choose the right one for you, whatever that is. And what do we mean by 4 trigger types, four main trigger types that are out there, Jacob?
So we're talking about the mechanics of how it functions. So one that I'll start with is probably been around for a long time that people are familiar with is a single action only. So single action only simply meaning that this is a gun that's designed such that it probably has a relatively light trigger. It's think like 1911. 1911 is like the classic single action only gun, and so the hammer is either being set manually or it's being set by the slide as it cycles each time. And that leaves you with a very short, light trigger press. It is that beautiful, wonderful, delightful trigger experience.
Yeah, I mean the gold standard in like good triggers is your classic 1911 trigger. Rather than it being a pivoting design, it goes straight forward or straight back, and then of course straight back forward again. It's got a double kind of wishbone shape to it. The trigger bow, as it's called, it wraps around the mag well on both sides. And so, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it's such a great trigger, because you press it and it goes straight back. There's none of this pivoting action, and it equally moves the sear together on both sides of that trigger bow. As a lot of common, modern designs, you press the trigger and it pivots, and there's extra friction that's created because you have a single trigger bar that runs on one side of the gun typically, and as you're pressing that, it actually creates like a torque in that whole mechanism. And so I don't mean to often, I can get into the nuts and bolts and weeds of the finer things of triggers and trigger design, but you just talked about single action triggers, or like a 1911 trigger. That's the most common one we see. There are other firearms like CZs. There's a few models of different CZ pistols, and also some revolvers, obviously, too, right? Where you've got to cock the hammer, and like an old Colt single action army type ripper as well. So single action only trigger typically means very nice trigger, light trigger. Are there any downsides to a trigger like that, Jacob?
Well, I think there's certainly considerations or best practices, and maybe that equates to a downside. But traditionally, with the single action only trigger, you're either carrying with the hammer in a forward position. So to deploy the gun, you have to cock the hammer, or you're carrying with the safety on, which is probably the more common methodology. So you have to train to operate that safety, because and this is for obvious reasons, right? The single action only, that wonderful, beautiful, crisp, short, light trigger is wonderful, but it also is a potential safety concern. And so that's why we generally see people carry that either with hammer forward. So I got to cock the hammer before I fire, or with some sort of safety on configuration. So now I have to train myself to disengage the safety when I deploy the gun, and then re-engage the safety when I holster the gun.
I don't really know many people that are carrying it with hammer forward or hammer
That would
down.
seem ridiculous, but I thought I'd mention it.
Okay, all right.
It's an option. Right. It's an option. I would consider it better than carrying it with hammer cocked and no safety.
I suppose there's people that are carrying non-chambered and are planning on drawing and racking the slide, and that would obviously cock the hammer, and then they'd fire their gun.
Sure.
We've hashed that type of topic before, and certainly you and I are proponents in concept and theory of carry with your gun ready to be used, implying that it's chambered, it's ready to go. The big thing for me that I see is the safety piece, right? So the standard practice with a lot of single action, particularly single action pistols, is that you'll have a manual safety. There was a time where that bothered me, like the idea that, oh man, I've got to hit a safety as I draw, as I go to shoot my gun. I would say it bothers me less so now. And really what it comes down to is no matter what tool or gun it is that you're carrying, you should be well versed in the operation of that gun. And it should be second nature. It should be so well practiced that regardless of how it functions, you are able to manipulate that firearm essentially automatically, subconsciously. So, if you're using a gun with a manual safety that requires deactivation to press and trigger, then you should be aware of that, and you better darn well make sure you know how to operate it on a subconscious level. You shouldn't have to think about it. It's kind of like I don't really carry a handgun with a safety on it, but I'm very well versed in running a carbine rifle, an AR-15 type platform rifle.
This was the metaphor I was going to use as well.
Yeah, and I don't even have to think about the safety on, safety off aspect of that. When the gun's going into use, meaning coming up into my shoulder, going up on target, safety goes off, right? When it comes off target, safety back on. So it's as simple as that. And if you just simply practice, it'll become second nature. And that's what we want to see. I'd say that we're seeing a little more of a trend right now of people carrying single action pistols in a different way than what you might think. So, the classic example is the 1911 that quite a few people these days still do carry. But we're seeing more and more pistols coming out that are of a double stack variety, single action trigger, 1911 type design, often referred to as a 2011. For instance, the Wilson Combat EDC X9, really cool pistol, been out for a couple of years now. It's essentially a 1911 design, but it's double stack. It's a proprietary double stack magazine design, but the guts of the gun and the top end of the gun are basically 1911. That's a single action only, and also staccato 2011 pistols, becoming more and more. I'm seeing more and more examples of those. So that's why it's relevant to today's discussion. And to be honest with you, I'm having some conversations with the folks at Staccato about those guns, and who knows, you might see one in my hands. So
one thing that I think is worth clarifying is the difference between a single action only revolver and a single action only semi-automatic, because that's also a distinct, different list of potential considerations or best practices. Because a single action semi-automatic, a single action only semi-automatic, like a 1911, the cycling of the slide recocks the hammer each time, right? So I'm still just operating the trigger. But the single action only revolver, you manually have to cock the hammer every time. And so I think that's just worth saying out loud. If you're like, oh, single action sounds like it's for me, bear in mind that there's a distinct difference between the way you operate a single action only revolver and a single action only semi-automatic.
Of course. I don't really see many people carrying single actions.
Well, they basically don't even make them anymore. I think you'd have a hard time buying one.
They are definitely way towards the bottom of the list of common
Yeah.
firearms that are purchased and carried.
The ones that are made
Um,
are designed to make to look like they were made 100 years ago. It seems like when I see them for sale, I'm like, you
Oh yeah.
when you made that, you wanted me to buy it and say, I now feel and look like John Wayne for sure.
Some modern examples actually though would be like your Bond Arms double barrel Derringer type
Sure.
guns, and which I'm not a big fan of those to be honest with you, but some people like them, and some people like them in the context of like a backup gun. I look at that kind of thing and I go, why? When I can have a Ruger LCP or something that's smaller and even lighter weight that can serve the purpose of a backup gun that has 3 or 4 times the capacity, So anyway, but yeah, relevant to the discussion, talking about different trigger types, considerations for those triggers, what what might be important to you to consider. I would say this much regarding, again, more of the 1911, 2011 design, single action, semi-automatic, with a manual or active safety that you got to turn on and turn off. The thing is, with guns like those, with one of the appeals of a gun like that is the trigger, and because of how nice it is and how much easier it is to shoot well and shoot accurately, because you don't have all this take up, and the trigger is lighter and just easier to use. But you have to flip that around a little bit and look at it from the aspect of, well, how well trained are you, and how good is your trigger finger discipline? Because particularly if you are transitioning over from something that's got a lot longer or stiffer trigger press or stroke, moving over to a light, short, single action trigger on like what is found on a lot of 1911s and 2011s might lend to you letting shots go a little bit early before you're really truly ready to send that shot. And there's certainly been examples of, but this has happened with all kinds of different triggers and designs of guns. But the fact is, we want to be careful, and if there's opportunities to reduce the likelihood of a negligent discharge or an inadvertent discharge, as we are faced with some kind of stressful situation, the gun's already out, but it's not necessarily being used, as in fired. Just be mindful of that. Okay, your trigger finger discipline has to be absolutely on point, as far as not pressing the trigger and not being on the trigger when it shouldn't be on the trigger. Right. And then, of course, that the whole question about the manual safety and just that being switched on and off automatically. So ideally, if the gun came out of the holster and you're going on target, the safety can come off. But if the situation changed, you felt like, I don't want to put my gun away yet, safety should probably go back on, meaning the gun comes off target, safety on. If we have to go back on target, should be pretty straightforward to put the safety, turn the safety back off. So anyway, just some considerations with single action, particularly semi-automatic pistol designs. Just know that there is a little bit of more training or learning curve to, I think, carrying and using a pistol like that responsibly in stressful self-defense situations.
Yeah, I guess my last thought on single action only is, if you've never shot one before, you're in for a treat. Yeah, you're gonna really enjoy it. It sure is a pleasure to shoot.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. Well, let's see. Let's move on to another trigger type. So, you started with the single action one. Well, that was found originally, as we've talked about, the 1911s. At least that particular design, so that goes back over 100 years, almost. In fact, it's 2021, so 110 years ago.
Yeah.
How about that? Let's work our way forward, I guess. So, by that I mean, let's take a look at I don't know. Let's talk about double action only. All right.
Double action only. Yeah.
Double action.
So
only,
I got to ask before we go any further, do you own a double action only gun?
I have to think about that a moment.
I do. I own one.
I know I used to. So I one time I owned
Yeah, I just have one.
an original, LCP, which is double action only. I have since now I have the LCP2, which is not double action. It's actually an internal hammer. It functions more like a single action, although the trigger feels like a striker fire trigger. I have a revolver that, if I was using in a defensive context, would be shot as though it's a double action only. I don't know that I have any other guns, though, that are actual true double action only actions at this current time.
I have a Kel-Tec
P11
P11 or P9. I think it's a P11.
Yeah.
I never shoot it. So anyway, that's my double action only gun. So double action only. So we have double action only semi-automatics and revolvers again. So double action only. The travel of the trigger is, in a really crude way, and Riley will correct everything I say wrong here anyway, but in a very crude way, the travel of the trigger is actuating the hammer, or the function of the hammer, to the rear and releasing it forward, all in the same single trigger squeeze. So what we generally find with double action triggers, they tend to be heavy. They tend to have a lot of travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as a general rule, I agree with all that. Yes. Not all are created equal, and there's certainly better ones and worse ones in terms of the quality of the trigger press. Now, going back to the single action thing, single actions are typically known for short travel, crisp break, and light, right? Double action only is generally known as being long travel, heavy, and not crisp, right? And so these are really kind of on the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? If you spent all your time only shooting a 1911 and then moved over to a really crappy long, like, okay, so honestly, the Kel-Tec P11 trigger, like what you have, Jacob,
Pretty
is
horrible.
not pleasant to shoot.
No.
It just isn't.
It just sucks. Yeah. You don't want to shoot that gun for like ever.
Mm-hmm. Conversely, a more modern example would be the Sig Sauer P250, the precursor to the 320. And I owned one for a brief time. I just, kind of a deal that fell in my lap, and picked one up and played with it for a few months until I got bored with it. And it's a DAO style gun, long travel, fairly heavy, although some things can be done aftermarket to lighten some of the springs and make it a little bit nicer. But I will say this much: the P250 trigger is fairly smooth. And so here's the thing: I will take heavy and smooth over a little less heavy and really crunchy, or with lots of what's the word? There's another word I'm missing to describe things like this.
Crunchy is pretty good.
Crunchy is probably, yeah. The P11 is pretty crunchy.
Not smooth. Yeah, it's like peanut butter, right? You got smooth and crunchy.
Yeah. You see, the thing is, when you have a trigger that has a lot little and along all that travel, there's like these little hiccups. You're like, just you keep kind of hitting these little like potholes, if you will, in the road as you're pressing the trigger, and that makes it really difficult to shoot.
Not fun.
And it makes it more difficult to. So the idea with a DAO pistol, like from a application standpoint, is you want to be using ideally like a rolling break. So the idea is you just start pressing the trigger and you just keep rolling through that trigger. And if you got to refine things a little bit more before you get to the actual break, you might pause a little bit as you get close to that break point. But ideally, you're just kind of rolling through that trigger. Just these long presses, and you're not really staging the trigger, and you're not looking for a wall or a crisp break point. You're just rolling through the trigger. So it makes it very difficult to roll through that trigger smoothly and keep sights and everything lined up on target if you have crunch in the trigger. So you want smooth. Again, I would almost take a 12-pound but very smooth trigger over, and I would say this too, very even if possible, There's different. Sometimes you'll have double action triggers that like are really heavily loaded at the front or really heavily stacked at the front part of the trigger, and then you get towards the back and then it sort of like falls off. Sometimes getting through that initial stacking of that can be pretty challenging. I'd almost rather just have it just be even and smooth all the way through.
Yeah, that's all very good. Like I was thinking about Diamondbacks. I don't own a Diamondback, but a lot of those smaller Diamondback, for all I know, all Diamondbacks are DAO. I really don't know. Oh, and by the way, for those, I don't know if you said it rightly, but DAO, double action only. That's what we're talking about. Just your shorthand there.
Yep.
But the Diamondbacks for me are similar in many ways to that Kel-Tec P11 in size and application, but they are smoother on the trigger for me. Not super amazingly smooth, not P250 smooth, but significantly improved over that P11. So double action only. I think the takeaway. I don't think of double action only DAO guns being really awesome for defensive purposes, like ever. Like I have a hard time thinking of good context for that because accuracy is going to be more difficult. Some better than others, to your point, but I think you're going to have a harder time being accurate with that gun. And just the overall deployment can be really challenging. And we find especially a lot of newer shooters, sometimes they gravitate to those guns because a lot of times these DAO guns are very small, very compact. They're micro compact guns. They look very appealing. They're, it's like, ooh, this is going to be perfect. This is going to fit in my whatever small thingy I'm putting this in. And so we see a lot of newer gun owners that sometimes, for lack of a better term, accidentally end up with a DAO little micro compact, and it is a disaster. It's just, you're stacking the odds against yourself to shoot well. And I like that. That was like a pun. Get it? Stacking. Ooh, I didn't even know I was doing it. So anyway, yeah. One thing I will say, we say DAO, double action only. And in the case of semi-automatic, double action only. That's kind of what you're getting. But double action revolvers, like you said, you have a double action revolver. That tends to be a gun that you optionally can shoot double action, or you can shoot single action. You can cock the hammer, and then you have a single action trigger press. So it's just worth noting that difference.
Yeah. By the way, Ghost Tactical commenting on YouTube says gritty, which was the word I was looking for. Crunchy, gritty. Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff. Thanks for having my back, Ghost Tactical. Yeah, so as I have become a more experienced shooter, I've gotten to a place where, and everybody obviously has their preferences, because I definitely know experienced shooters that prefer things different than what I prefer.
Sure.
But I'm to a place now where I prefer a trigger that feels or operates more like what you'd find with it's like that allows me to use kind of that rolling trigger break technique, where I'm just, the trigger just breaks really smoothly when you get towards the rear of the travel, but there's take up and it's just smooth and fairly light all the way through that. So my current competition pistol, I've got a Gray Guns trigger in that's been worked over, and it's pretty light. It's like 2 3/4 pound, or 2 3/4 pounds, whatever. I don't know. And but there's definitely a wall, but from that wall to where it actually breaks, there's a bit of travel, but that travel is smooth and fairly light, and there's not like a super defined, like wall right before it breaks. It's just,
sure,
you hit the wall, the initial wall, and you just press through that. And if you've ever felt a really well broken in or a really nicely worked over West revolver, that has a really nice double action, even though it's long, maybe it's a long but 6 pounds or 7 pounds, which is fairly light for a long double action revolver trigger. If you've ever felt one of those and you just start taking it up, and it's light enough, it's not really tiring. It doesn't tire you out after you shoot a bunch of rounds. It's just smooth and even all the way through that. Like that honestly is really easy for me to shoot with now. And so I've come to find that I prefer that, as opposed to a trigger that has a really defined break point. because for me personally, and it might just be how my brain works, but when I have a trigger that has a really defined break, I tend to have more issues with shanking shots, getting the classic down and left sort of anticipation where, you get to that break point, to that really defined wall, and you're like, oh, there's my sight, send it. And you twitch a little bit as you break through that. Like people will describe a really amazing light trigger as like a desirable trait. They would, or a term they would use to describe that this desirable trait would be like a glass rod breaking, if that makes sense. Like a thin glass rod, and you want to be able to press that and it resists, but then all of a sudden it goes snap. I shank more shots with triggers like that. So at one
Did
time,
you say shank shots? That's funny.
Shot, yeah, or finch, or whatever you want to call it. I find I'm more able to manage my sight picture and keep everything dialed in and lined up all the way through the shot going off. If there's no well-defined wall or break, I'm just pressing. So as I'm managing the sights, I'm just press, bang, press, bang, and it works really well for me. So the DAO trigger that we're talking about right now, this type anyway, if they're really heavy, they can be tiring to shoot for a lot of shots. If they're gritty or crunchy, they're difficult to shoot for obvious reasons. But in this day and age especially, and this has been true for a long time, but there's great companies out there. I mean, if you have a Beretta, send it off to Langdon Tactical and get that sucker worked over. If you have a CZ, send it to Cajun Gunworks and have them work it over. If you have a Sig, send it off to Gray Guns and get that thing worked over. There's a lot of work that can be done to smooth those double action triggers out. And that's the key to me, is if you can lighten it a little bit, if you can get it in that 6 to 8 pound range and have it be smooth all the way through the travel, I have no problem shooting a DAO gun if it is smooth and lighter than is typical for double action pistols.
Yeah, I was just looking to see. I know we have had past episodes where we've talked about the arguments for and against trigger modifications. Mm-hmm. So we don't need to get into it here, but I did look up episode 298 is probably a good one if anyone's like, ooh, what would Jacob and Riley, actually, I don't know if I'm in that one. I think it's you and Matthew, but what would we say about the good and the bad of getting your trigger modified? You just made a potential argument in favor of modifying a double action trigger, but episode 298, we talk more about that topic.
Absolutely. The funny thing too, Jacob, is that for years and years and years, cops and experienced gun carriers have been improving triggers on like older revolvers, double action revolvers in particular. And people didn't get all worked up about modifying old revolvers, but as soon as you start talking about modifying triggers on a more modern striker fired pistol, people like lose their crap. At least that's the impression I get. I've got a stack of old gun magazines that I've gone through in years past. Some of these I inherited from my grandpa that passed away a couple years back, and there's articles in there from like the 70s and 80s of talking about improving your double action revolver trigger and stuff, and people weren't freaking out about you getting thrown in jail over shooting a dude, but you had a modified trigger and whatnot. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of context specific things. And so, just like when we were talking about carrying with the safety and having it safety on, that was very context specific to a single action only gun. And this also, we're talking right now about modifying a trigger, and we're in this context talking specifically about a double action only gun.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. And again, we don't have to go all the way into the weeds on this one. I did want to bring up this quick comment from John on Facebook. This is actually a fair point to note, because we talked about single action pistols and triggers, and he says, getting back to safeties, he has a Smith & Wesson Shield 9mm 2.0 with a safety. And he says carrying with safety on is almost impossible to get off because of the design. I don't carry with safety on. I'll say this much. I think the safety on the Shield is more easily manipulated than the safety on the P365s, on the safety equipped models. And I don't think the 365s are absolutely horrible in that respect, because I think they're relatively usable. But this is, I think, a fair point to bring up. If you're going to carry a gun with a safety, make sure the design of that safety is usable, because there are definitely some out there that are so low profile or lacking in texture or whatever that it's more difficult for you to consistently manipulate them. So
yeah, like a 938 or a 238, those are designs that I struggle with. With that safety. Some of those really small cars or Kel-Tecs, that are 1911 designs. Those like, for me, I don't have an issue, disengaging that safety in the deployment of a full size gun. But some of those micro compacts, that safety is pretty hard for me to operate in that condition.
Yep. So anyway, good point, and a good observation, John. And I'm glad you recognize that. This is a problem. And the thing I would throw out too, for your sake, John, is he's saying, hey, I'm not gonna carry it with the safety on because it's hard for me to disengage. A caution with that. You should probably still train to sweep your thumb down as you're drawing that gun, even if you don't have the safety already on. And that pistol, by the way, is completely safe to carry without the safety on. That's not the issue. But my concern is, what if that safety somehow gets bumped on or switched on while you're carrying the gun? Okay. Particularly if it's like an ambidextrous safety and the safety's on the outside of the gun. See, it's one thing if it's on one side, right? And the holster is designed to cover that safety and keep it from being an issue. But regardless, if that safety got inadvertently switched on somehow, and your normal mode of carrying and practice is safety off already, you go to draw and use the gun, and you're not training, you're not practicing to make sure that safety's off. So that could get you in trouble where you're pressing the trigger and not getting any bang, not getting any pews, because the safety's on and you're not expecting it to be on. So just some things to maybe think through there. And if you have the option of switching it around different non-safety model, whatever, or maybe, who knows, maybe there's an aftermarket part that replaces that safety with something that's a little more usable for you. I don't know. Give it some thought and make sure that you don't set yourself up for failure. Or as Mark says, just buy a Glock. Well, we haven't gotten to striker fired triggers yet, so hang on. All right.
I think before striker fire, the natural progression here is the DASA gun.
Yeah, I think so. A little before striker fired, right? So DASA, double action, single action, and it was popularized particularly with the classic line pistols from Sig, the original P series guns, 226, 229, 220, right? So double action, single action. Jacob, you've got a couple of those. I've got a couple myself.
I only have one.
Oh, I thought you had two.
I'm pretty sure I only have the one.
You got a 229. I know that much.
Yeah, my 229, which I love that gun. Huge fan. I've had. I would put that on my list of guns that I consider battle tested. Like, I've put it through some good stuff. So that, not like in battle, by the way. I've never been in battle
tested.
But when I say battle tested, like with asterisk, meaning like I've shot it a lot under stress. Anyway, so DASA. So my 229 is a great example. So this is a gun where basically the premise of the DASA gun is that the first trigger press is going to be a double action trigger press, and then subsequent shots would be single action. The thinking here would be that you do carry a DASA gun in the hammer forward position, and so that first trigger squeeze, you have a double action trigger because you have to actuate the hammer to the rear with that long traditional double action trigger squeeze, whatever that might be for that particular make and model. But then the cycling of the slide is recocking your hammer to make every subsequent follow-up shot single action. Thus, the DASA double action, single action verbiage. vernacular, whatever. So a lot of people like this. For one, and I'm sure you'll talk about, modifications and, working it and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of people like this because there's maybe a little bit of like a safety blanket around this idea that first trigger squeeze is going to be, takes a little bit of weight, a little bit of higher pounds of pressure on the trigger. I don't have to be maybe as concerned about it not going well for me, about the safety concern that I might otherwise have with the single action only or with a striker fire, which we'll talk about soon. So that first trigger squeeze is a little bit heavier. But, once I've engaged the gun, right, once I've, broken that first shot, man, now I'm left with like that beautiful, crisp, wonderful, experience of shooting that is just so hard to parallel with the other styles of guns, other than, of course, the single action only, right? Those follow-up shots are just so crisp and light and wonderful that it's almost makes it worth it to go through that little bit of pain on that first trigger press. Most DASA guns, maybe all of them for all I know, but certainly I think I'm safe in saying most have a decocker, because obviously when you load the gun, you're inserting a magazine full of ammo and you have to cycle the slide to load around into the chamber, but now your hammer is to the rear, and that's problematic. So a decocker is used to release that hammer forward in a manner that's safe so that gun can then be carried in that fashion safely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So before I provide any further commentary on DASAs, I do want to kind of take this as an opportunity to highlight a couple of reasons why someone might want to carry something that has a double action trigger. There's a conversation in our Facebook comments going on right now where someone's saying, well, I like this, I like DASA, and someone else is saying, well, why? Everyone has everyone has strong opinions about what they like and what they don't like. I mean, some people are like, well, just get a Glock. It's just so simple. Well, yeah, it is. And that is, there's a lot of validity to the idea of just carrying a gun that operates very simply and doesn't have a lot of things to be concerned with. But let me kind of provide some additional points to consider. Probably one of the big reasons DAO guns, double action only guns, or guns that were intended to be, I mean, for instance, take like an older Smith & Wesson revolver where they bobbed the hammer. It was a common practice and still is to this day for carry, especially deep carrying, deep concealment. Revolvers would be, obviously there's revolvers that are made that have internal hammers or the hammer's designed in such a way as to be a double action only revolver, but it was a common practice by guys to actually bob the hammer or cut the hammer, the spur of the hammer off, so that revolver became a double action only. Now, why am I going back to DAOs and talking about this, and why is this relevant to the discussion on DASA? Well, one of the reasons why carrying something like a double action only revolver, which was really kind of the only option in the, say 70, 80 years ago, was because you might be carrying that gun in non-traditional ways. In other words, like just throwing the gun in a pocket, for instance, and not using a holster. Now, in today's age, there's really little reason to not just always use a decent quality holster with how you carry a gun. At the very least, there's good quality pocket holsters, and there's we even have products like the Enigma from Filster that allows for some creative deep carry, deep concealment options that just weren't really possible or didn't really exist 50, 60, 70 years ago. The point is, a DAO really had some application for a lot of concealed carriers, guys working deep undercover, working drug operations, or if you just lived in a really dangerous neighborhood or place and just didn't want to be made. So you're carrying a gun in a non-traditional way, in a manner that allows you to absolutely maintain concealment and discretion. And so you might be inclined to carry a gun that has a heavy, long, double action trigger because it's a little bit safer. There's a little bit of a safety factor, and that you're less likely to have that trigger get inadvertently pressed while you're carrying it and causing a problem. So I just want to kind of go back and use this as an opportunity to talk about the merits of a double action trigger. So there's some safety involved as it relates to carrying of the gun. DASA guns are making a little bit of a comeback, I'd say, right now, because you have more and more people, I think, trying appendix carry, and there's just a little bit of a reassurance and a bit more of a safety factor carrying appendix, having a DASA gun, having a trigger that's heavier as you're trying to reholster in a position that's widely acknowledged as being sensitive, right? And requiring care. You know, a lot of DASA guns have the external hammer on the back, and placing your thumb over top of that hammer as you're reholstering the gun, not a bad practice, because you can feel that hammer, and you know that if something were to get in the way of the holster, get inside of the trigger guard, or if you just simply made the mistake for whatever reason, finger on the trigger as you're reholstering, that hammer started to move, you're going to feel it, and your thumb's going to keep pressure against it and keep that gun from discharging. So there's valid reasons why a DASA gun or a double action gun of any type has some merit, and some people find that to be important. I have a double action, single action SP 2022 off with gray guns still being worked on. They're putting their new fancy trigger kit in that, making it really, really awesome. And there might be times I decide to carry that because, one, I actually like that gun and I like shooting it. And in the appendix position, there's just that extra safety factor, going back to the holster and you know, thumb over the hammer. So there's some things to think about there, right? So there's reasons behind this. Now the other thing too, is more of a tactical, or, well, it's a safety function or safety factor as well on the use side of the gun, meaning that when we have a double action trigger, it's a very deliberate act when we press the trigger. And so again, you know, I cautioned you a little bit ago about if you're carrying a single action gun, you really got to be on point in terms of your trigger finger safety and discipline to make sure you don't accidentally send a round off when you don't expect it in a stressful situation. Well, that's one of the reasons why some law enforcement agencies mandate that their officers carry certain guns. That's one reason why some agencies have selected guns like the 226 or the 229, was for that reason, knowing that if our officers draw their guns, that first shot before it can go off, it has to be a very deliberate act and a decision attached to that, more so than a lighter trigger. Cases like the NYPD, even with their Glocks, you know, guys are, you know, people are familiar with the New York trigger, you know, where Glock had to design a whole trigger modification to make that Glock trigger 12 pounds. Just insane. It's really not a pleasant trigger in the case of a Glock. So there's valid reasons. I don't necessarily ascribe to all of that myself, but I see why people view those things as being important, or placing more importance upon factors like that. And so that's kind of the why you might choose or select a DAO or DASA gun, is for that extra safety factor in cases of holstering, but also on the use side of it, so that we really know that we're really having to work our way to that trigger for that first shot.
Yeah, I'll add two things, then you should have one more to add. If not, I'll prompt you for it. But like we talked about with single action only, where you have to build a habit relative to disengaging and re-engaging a safety, a DASA gun does require you to build a habit to decock it every time you're done shooting it. So there is an additional step that the user has to learn and adapt to, right? With this gun, when I get done firing, assuming the gun's not empty and I'm showing clear, you know, I got to hit the decocker before I reholster. So that's one thing. Another thing I was going to mention is that you know, there's a great value or benefit or convenience, at least, when it comes to doing dry fire with a DASA or DAO gun. because in dry fire, I don't have to recycle the slide every single time. If I have a double action gun or a DASA gun, then I can dry fire that thing with repeated trigger presses without having to cycle the slide to reset the trigger every time. So that's kind of a little practical, benefit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Those are important things as well. Let's also just point out that there are a few examples of DASA pistols that allow for both carry options, meaning that you would decock it traditionally like you would and place it in double action mode upon putting it in holster. There are some examples that actually that the decocker also functions as a safety and allows us to flip it the other way and leave it in single action and flip the safety on.
Sure.
So examples of that would be some pistols from HK. There's also a few examples from CZ as well that do some similar things. Here's the idea with DASA pistols, right? If you get some of the benefits like I just got done talking about with regards to double action, first trigger press, but you get all benefits for your follow-up shots of that light, short, ideal trigger press that many people like, that is akin to those found on 1911 and 2011s and such. And that's not a bad thing. I'll tell you what. I mean, and Jacob, you know this. You love shooting single action shots on your Sig.
Yeah,
it's awesome. It's money. Like
it's a beautiful day.
You can be accurate. You can run that thing fast, right? So where people have the biggest struggle is on the double action part. And you know that as well from personal experience, as do I. I mean, that was something I struggled with in years past. For a time, I carried a DASA gun as my duty pistol. Mark here on Facebook comments that he does great with single action. Yep, just like we all do typically, but tend to shank the first double action trigger press. He says, I know it's there, but the length of the pull messes me up. So this is a training issue, right? One, it's something that just takes time and practice to get used to that. But also there's some technique involved as well, Mark. In an ideal world, as you are drawing that pistol and as you are, once you get to about where your hands meet or join on the grip, and then you start going out towards your target, it's a common practice to go ahead and start taking up slack on that double action first press, so that by the time you reach your extended presentation, you should be pretty close to where all you got to do is finish off that trigger. And that's the first thing. If you're gonna and go watch some videos, Ernest Langdon's some great videos about this. About some techniques related to that first DA trigger press.
He is the high priest of the DASA religion.
Yes, he is. Spencer Keepers as well is known for his love of the Berettas and such. Our own Brian Eastridge, that hosts the On Duty Off Duty podcast, loves his Berettas and DASA guns as well. But yeah, the point is, and this is one of the reasons why, Mark, it's not a bad idea to consider having that double action part of the trigger especially worked over and just made a little bit lighter and particularly smoother. And it'll really help you on that first trigger press. But the idea is, again, that we're taking a lot of that slack up as we're finishing our draw and presentation. And then you just have a little bit more to do as you get to where you're finalizing your sight picture, making sure everything's dialed in, and you send the shot. If you are drawing and getting out there, getting sights on target, and then applying pressure on the trigger, that's where you're going to tend to struggle more. At least that's true with me. And that'll help you too in that transition between DA to SA, double action to single action. Because if you're doing it that way and you're getting a lot of that work done as you're finishing the draw, by the time you get on target and you send the shot, that last little bit's quite a bit easier to press typically. And then the gun cycles and you go right to single action. And there's just psychologically, at least for me, seems to be less of a disparity between, because I don't notice the double action press as much when I'm getting on it a little bit sooner. I know some people would say that's what are you talking about, Riley? Like, we're touching the trigger before we're totally on target. Remember, context is important. That's the first thing I'll say. And secondly, if I know I have a threat or a target that I got to shoot, and I'm up here, high center chest, hands are joining, and the gun's oriented towards that target, technically, at least, again, it's situationally dependent, but in most situations, I'm calling that as I'm on target now. I'm getting on this trigger. Okay. If you watch slow video of me shooting you my striker fired guns, watch where my finger goes on the trigger when I'm going fast, right? When I'm going for that sub-second draw, first shot on target, watch my fingers getting on the trigger. It has to get in there a little bit earlier than what you might expect if you're going to succeed in firing an accurate, fast first shot. But it's context dependent. All right. So just a little bit of advice, some things to consider there.
Yep, and we could talk more about that concept of prepping the trigger and how that relates to the safety rules, and if that's a concern for some. But that might be a good dedicated episode sometime.
Sure. Yep. So that kind of brings us to the fourth, and probably arguably, at least in this day and age, the most widespread and most commonly used trigger type, which is striker fired.
Yeah.
There was a time where people spent a lot of effort trying to fit things like Glocks and Sig, or Glocks and MMPs and stuff into a box of, is it single action? Is it double action? The reality is a lot of those striker fired mechanisms are unique, and they some of them work different from others. Whether the striker is slightly pre-tensioned or all the way pre-tensioned, meaning it's all the way back and the trigger is released in a striker, or in the case of a Glock where the striker is like half cocked and you're pressing the trigger and it's cocking it the rest of the way. You know what I mean? Like, the point is we've gotten to a place where we just say, you know what? If it's striker fired, it just means it's absent a hammer, and we just lump all those together. And really the key is to a striker fired trigger in terms of definition is it's a hammerless trigger system that typically has the same trigger press for every shot, from first shot to last shot. That's kind of the unique characteristics and how I would define a striker fired pistol.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. And I think that for a lot of people, there's a lot of simplicity value. This idea that I don't have to think about, the first trigger press. I don't think about the decock, or I don't have to think about is this going to be different on the follow-up shots. I don't have to think about safety, perhaps, disengaging, engaging. And I'm going to have a relatively good trigger all the time. It's sort of like that middle place between the double action trigger and the single action trigger, where, your double action trigger might have been 8 to 15 pounds of pressure, and your single action trigger, I don't know, like a pound or something awesome. But your traditional striker fire trigger is like that kind of midline average, somewhere in the middle, where it's not the super light single action trigger, but it's not that heavy double action trigger, and it's the same every time. And so there's this, I think those are the two like major appealing factors. One, this idea of simplicity, like just press the trigger, like, yes, get around in the chamber and then press the trigger. And then this other idea of just, it's a pretty good trigger every time. And it's the same trigger every time. So, like, Riley, what's the Glock out of the factory? What's the weight?
Advertised they're supposed to be 5.5 pounds, except in the case of the Glock 34 and 35, which is their competition models that are advertised as 4.5 pounds.
So there you go. So that that's kind of to the point, right? Like, we're not talking about a 2-pound trigger, we're not talking about a 1-pound trigger. We're also not talking about a 12-pound trigger. It's kind of that, in the middle somewhere, where I feel like it's pretty good every time, and it's the same every time, and it's the essence of simplicity.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. I would say that it seems to be kind of the industry average or trend that if you're in a strike fired pistol, your trigger weight is usually between 5 and 7 pounds from the factory. That's pretty common, pretty typical. The other common thing is a lot of striker fired guns will have a trigger safety tab or safety shoe, or that little mini trigger that inside the trigger that you have to press. Excuse me, that you have to press first. before you can press the actual trigger, the part of the trigger. There's a few, exceptions to that, as far as like the 320 series being the most commonly known one that doesn't have that trigger safety, tab or shoe or whatever. But the thing with striker fired triggers, you typically have an initial slack and take up of the trigger till you get to some sort of a wall. Usually that wall is where the trigger bar actually starts pulling, usually downward, the actual sear of the trigger mechanism in the back, where it hooks up with the striker. And so that's kind of the unique thing with striker fires, is you'll have trigger safety, slack, wall, and then you start pressing the wall and it starts pulling that sear, and then eventually you break through that and the sear releases the striker and it goes forward and fires the gun. It's unique because you do have this multi-stage trigger. In the case of a 1911, it a lot of times they do have an initial little bit of slack. It's usually so slight, it's almost not noticeable. You pretty much get to, and you can tune 1911s a lot of times to have no take up and just basically be a solid trigger, or straight to the wall. You know what I mean? So, and then you have DAO guns or double action pistols that are sort of like this long rolling press through it, and there's not a real defined wall or break point. So striker fireds really are kind of that in-betweener. And they are very manageable triggers, and they can be made to be quite good, but they do fit very well in between that single action and that double action side of the spectrum, if you will, like you were just talking about, Jacob. Here's what I would say. I mean, okay, so where we're at right now in the industry and with what people tend to choose for guns is the striker fired gun is where it's at.
It's the dominant player, yeah.
Yeah, by far, right? That is very apparent. And I think for a lot of reasons, like you mentioned, there's valid reasons as to why that is. For one thing, they are guns that are typically pretty inexpensive to manufacture. When we get into like 1911s and double action guns, there's just a little bit more going on there, and a little more fine tuning that has to happen to make those triggers work well and to work right and be safe. Striker fired trigger mechanisms typically are pretty simple, and they don't require necessarily a lot of tuning because of the way they're designed. So that's why we see striker fired guns being as inexpensive as they are when we compare them to their DASA and single action counterparts. But also, like you mentioned, having the same trigger press from shot to shot to shot, even though it might not be as nice as a single action only trigger, well, at least it's predictable and you can get used to it, and you can get to where you learn how to use it very effectively.
And it's manageable. I mean, it's not crazy heavy.
Right. Yeah, that's right. I think it's appropriate for when we're talking about kind of the defensive gun, if you will, for the average person, the average shooter, having something between 4 and 7 pounds is not a bad idea, because it's kind of in that middle ground of it still has to be a pretty deliberate, act to press through the trigger. But it's not so heavy that it's difficult to use typically either.
Yeah, I think it definitely, that 4 or 5 pound mark is probably a minimum necessary thing for at least a first trigger press, right? And so in the case of the DASA, if you want to have lighter subsequent shots, I don't see any issue with that. But yeah, I think that's probably a good ballpark, guiding idea.
I think when you're writing policy for like a large police agency, I can understand why some agencies, end up where they do, and some of these considerations they make. I think, again, for the general public, when you're talking about people that on average are not particularly well trained or well practiced, it's not a bad idea to have a little more effort required to press a trigger. Especially when you have people that, when I say untrained, not only in the act of shooting a gun, but just aren't very well adjusted or well trained in the idea of stressful, deadly force defense, right? So So at the end of the day, I hope our discussion today has given you all some things to consider, and many of you already are set on where you're at and happy with where you're at. But maybe some things we've talked about today give you cause to, I don't know, think through and understand maybe some of the whys behind why you choose a particular gun or a particular trigger type or action type, as far as the gun you're carrying for personal defense. As it relates, though, this would be kind of the last thing I'd end on, Jacob, and then I'll throw it back to you for final words. These are all different triggers. I think there's some merit to learning to press the trigger. Okay, so you got your trigger finger, learning how to move that trigger finger in a manner that makes the adjustment from trigger to gun as little an issue as possible. By that, I mean, I read not really an article, but wrote it up on his Facebook page, and that is Patrick Kelly, who is a well-known, long-time competitive shooter. He was on the podcast with us at SHOT Show a year or two ago, and Patrick wrote this really great post talking about how he's done this thing on his YouTube channel for years, where I can't remember exactly what he calls it, but the concept is he gets a gun, whether it's a gun he gets in for review, like a T&E model from a manufacturer, or sometimes you just go to the gun shop and buy up a random gun, just different things that he wanted to try or was curious about, and he'd do these little reviews. And his review concept was get gun to range to actual match, like a IDPA or USPSA or Steel Challenge match, and he'd take the gun right out of the case, however it came in the box, couple of mags, load it up, and go shoot a match. And what was interesting is he's doing this with guns of all different types and all different actions and triggers and so forth. And so his takeaways on this was pretty interesting. And basically what he was saying is learn how to move your trigger finger out and all the way back through as smoothly as you can. And essentially suggesting whether you're shooting a DAO gun, where you have to go all the way out and take all that slack back up and press through the trigger, or if you're shooting a shorter single action trigger, hey, fire the shot, get off that trigger, get back on the trigger, fire another shot, and do that. Learn how to do that trigger motion as smoothly as you can. And the proof is in the pudding, as far as when you look at his performance from match to match to match, from gun to gun to gun, all these different guns with different triggers. There's people tend to say, hey, I don't like that gun because it would be hard for me to shoot it because of the trigger that it has. It's very different from this other thing that I'm used to. Patrick's argument is learn how to do this, meaning press and release all the way and come back on it and press again and do that smoothly. And it really doesn't matter what the trigger, what trigger the gun has. Just put sights on target, press trigger, and that's where the round's going to go. I find that pretty interesting. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. If you look at how I run my trigger these days, very different from a few years ago, where I was very much in the mode of press trigger, fire shot, only release to where the reset point is, fire again. Now, these days, I fire, my finger comes probably within a quarter inch of touching the front of the trigger guard, and then come back on the trigger. And some of that is because of speed, because it's just, you want to get off the trigger fast and get back on it again. And to do that, it's really irrelevant how far your finger comes off the trigger. And some of that is it works with so many different guns. So anyway, some interesting things to consider, and maybe play around with that, guys, with your different guns and your different triggers.
Yeah, I think that you got to figure out where you're at in the journey, and you got to say, if I own one gun, and I'm new at this, then I better go figure out what my trigger feels like, and work that gun a lot and get some practice. But if you've not owned some of these other guns we're talking about, if you've never fired a 1911, if you've never fired a DASA gun, I think there's value to putting those in your hand and giving them a shot, and getting an understanding of potential pitfalls and or pros or cons of each of these different types of trigger systems.
Yep. Well, there you have it. It's time to wrap it up. I think we're actually tied over time, but thank you for doing this episode with me today, Jacob.
De nada.
So, guys, one last shout out. Make sure you go check out readyupgear.com. look for the Ranger Roger 22 ear protection over the ear earmuffs. Got those back in stock. We got a bunch of them. Okay. And they look great. They're, we're getting awesome feedback and reviews from folks on these Roger 22s. So we're proud to have that brand, Ready Up Gear, and be a part of concealedcarry.com family. And also the new Soft Seal gel ear pads from Ready Up Gear as well. Pick up a set for your favorite pair of ear protection and stop hating the pinching and the discomfort of your ear pro at the range. So with that, we're going to let you all go. Have a great rest of your week. We'll be back here next week. And so a reminder to train right, train often, and train safe so you can fight hard, fight fast, and fight true. Take care.